Well, welcome one and all. It's a pleasure to be with you again, and thank you for joining us in our latest installment of our Saturday seminars. I see there's a lot of familiar faces, but I also wanted to mention that we're joined today by some out-of-staters from California, Connecticut, Massachusetts, I think Pennsylvania we may have, and Illinois. So welcome to the non-Wisconsin folks. I need to, first of all, extend my thanks to Lily Chattopadhyay and Tom Lindley. They're colleagues of mine at the Center for the Study of the American Constitution. Without them, the logistics of all of this would be impossible. So thanks to them. We're also joined today by Chris Kavanaugh, who in my estimation is one of the best teachers in the country, and we've worked with him quite a bit over the years, and it's great to see him with us again today. He'll be facilitating one of the breakout sessions. John Kaminsky is also joining us today, and without John's overarching direction and guidance, none of this professional development would be the way it is. So his hand is always present in our efforts in outreach to teachers. When Jonathan begins his presentation, if you could mute in an effort to stabilize the Zoom call, that would be great. Unmute when we get to the question and answer sessions, as well as in the discussion sessions. When we get back from the first discussion session, Lily wants to take a screenshot. So Jonathan, when we come back from that first discussion group, there'll be a quick screenshot to get a picture of us all. We'll put that on our website, and then you can begin that second presentation. We have joining us today an outstanding scholar. We are very pleased to be able to present and be associated with Jonathan Gienapp. He's an assistant professor at Stanford University. We might prefer to call it the UW-Madison of the West Coast. Now he's an assistant professor there by way of Harvard and Johns Hopkins. And his recent book is the basis of our discussion today, The Second Creation, Fixing the Constitution in the Founding Era. Many of us who read Jack Rakoff's book years ago, Original Meanings, I think will find Jonathan's book in a way an extension of that, of Jack Rakoff's book. And so I'm excited to hear firsthand his thoughts on this idea of, when is the most important moment when we consider the founding period in terms of how what the Constitution means. So without any further ado, Jonathan, the next 40 minutes are all yours.
Wonderful. Well, first of all, everyone can hear me, I hope. I'm going to share my screen since this is the world we now live in. And I hope everyone can see that. Great. All right. Well, I'm delighted to be here this morning to have a chance to chat with you about some important constitutional debates that took place shortly after the Constitution was written and ratified, and that often don't receive quite the attention that I think they sometimes deserve. But before I begin, I did want to take a moment to thank John Kaminsky, Tim Moore, and everybody else at the Center for the Study of the American Constitution, both for this invitation to chat with you this morning, but as well for their enormously important work, without which people like me simply could not do what we do. There's really nothing more important to the scholarly enterprise of studying the early Constitution than the work that the Center does. Okay, so today I'm going to tell you a bit about the constitutional debates that took place in the first federal Congress, which are what I chronicle in my book that Tim just mentioned, shown here, The Second Creation, Fixing the American Constitution in the Founding Era. And in particular, I'm going to focus on two of the debates that I look at there. First, the so-called removal debate, which was a debate over who could remove executive officers in the national government. And then second, the so-called bank debate over the constitutionality of chartering a national bank. But before diving into these two debates, I thought I would begin by setting the scene just a little bit and try to explain why the constitutional debates that took place in the first Congress were, in my mind, so important and consequential, both in their own time, but also for how we today might think about those debates in relationship to the story we often tell ourselves about how the Constitution was created. I think sometimes the focus of that story, the creation of the Constitution, can be unduly narrow, focusing almost exclusively on the events that took place in 1787 and 1788 when the Constitution was written and ratified. Most accounts of the Constitution's creation focuses on these years. Many books focus just on the Constitutional Convention itself, the summer of 1787, when between May and September, 55 delegates descended on Philadelphia, of course, and wrote the document that is still our fundamental law 234 years later. Many of those stories will carry it forward into the following year to chronicle ratification, the tumultuous 9-month or so period, depending upon when you consider ratification to have ended, in which the American public weighed whether to, in fact, accept this Constitution that the convention proposed. But in a lot of people's mind, I think, in a lot of tellings of the Constitution's creation, ratification often marks the end of the story of constitutional creation, and then the beginning of a very different story that comes next, that of merely interpreting a constitution that now exists. Now, don't get me wrong, there's no denying the importance of 1787 and 1788. They deserve an enormous amount of attention. They deserve serious study. But among the things I want to suggest this morning are that I think we also need to recognize that the decade that followed ratification did as much to create the Constitution as anything that came before. To really understand how the Constitution was made, we need to understand this so-called second creation, as I call it. So why is this so? Why was the Constitution not simply created when it was written and ratified? To begin to understand this, I think we need to appreciate an important, if little recognized fact, which is when the Constitution first appeared, it was shrouded in uncertainty. Not only was its meaning unclear, but even more significant than that, it was unclear what the Constitution itself actually was. So in 1789, when members of the new federal government began putting the freshly ratified Constitution into effect, they could not simply ask, what does this part of the Constitution mean? Or what does that part of the Constitution mean? They first had to answer a more fundamental question, which was, what even was the Constitution? Because no matter the depth of American constitutional debate to that point, and it had been very deep and had been going on for decades to this point, there was still, at the time the Constitution was ratified, no straightforward answers to a host of questions that really cut to the Constitution's very core. What kind of an object was the Constitution? Was it simply a written text? Was it a system of constituent powers? Was it a framework for future politics? Was it something else entirely? What kind of a thing was it? What defined its character? Was it like other legal instruments that existed at the time? Was it like a statute, maybe a contract, a corporate charter, a treaty, maybe other constitutions? Or maybe it was completely novel in kind, utterly unprecedented. And this raised other questions about its relationship to conventional law. Was it a lawyer's text? Was it a people's text? What was its character? A third major question that was open, was it a complete and finished instrument, or was it incomplete and unfinished, leaving it for subsequent users to fill in its gaps and resolve its potential contradictions? Fourth, did it come with any built-in rules for using it? Did it come with a user's manual? What were the rules that were to guide usage of the Constitution? If those didn't come with the Constitution, where were those to be found? Did they have to be invented? And then lastly, of course, was its meaning set in stone or was it changing? None of these questions had straightforward answers. And these were not just questions about what this word meant or what that word meant. They were bigger questions about what kind of thing the Constitution itself even was. The Constitution in many ways was born in flux. And this is among the reasons why James Madison said this: "We're in a wilderness without a single footstep to guide us." He was testifying in 1789 to some of this uncertainty, some of this deep uncertainty that really forced those who arrived under the Constitution to think about it. So what this means, I think, is that those early leaders who gathered under the Constitution's auspices, they could not merely carry a well-understood instrument into effect. In order to implement the Constitution, they first had to begin answering those questions I just specified. To carry the Constitution into effect, they had to begin hammering out answers to those questions. And indeed, they had suggested as much during ratification. In the face of a battery of complaints that the Constitution was unclear and that its various clauses were ambiguous, James Madison replied that this was simply inevitable. As he famously wrote in Federalist 37, "No language is so copious as to supply words and phrases for every complex idea. As a result, all new laws, though penned with the greatest technical skill, are considered as more or less obscure and equivocal until their meaning be liquidated and ascertained by a series of particular discussions and adjudications." The Constitution was unfinished, in other words, because it had to be. And it would be the job of those who took office under it to not merely carry it into effect, but to finish the task of actually creating it. And for no group was this more clearly the case, I think, than those who served in the first federal Congress. As the first crop of national leaders under the Constitution, they were really the very first ones to confront these unresolved constitutional questions, and thus the ones empowered to do the most about them. Today, we might think that either the president or the Supreme Court, because they're really, in many ways, the dominant constitutional actors in our own system, might have been the first movers in 1789, but that was very much not the case. Not only if we return to 1789, we find that legislatures were really considered the dominant branch under Republican government, but in a more practical sense, in the spring of 1789, the legislature, Congress, was the only branch of government that functionally existed. There was no national government until Congress created one. Among the extremely important things they had to do in 1789 was actually create was actually flesh out the bare bones skeleton of an executive and judicial branch that the Constitution had established. They had to create executive departments and executive officers to create the executive branch we know. They had to create a federal court system and federal judgeships to create the federal court system we know. So really, Congress was the first mover. It was really their game that they got to play first, which is why so many people at the time referred to Congress in these terms. As James Warren wrote to Elbridge Gerry as he was heading off to Congress, all eyes are looking up to Congress. William Pickman wrote, "The people this way are on tiptoe in their expectations from Congress. We expect more than angels can do from your body." And perhaps most revealing of all, Samuel Osgood said, "I consider the first Congress as a second convention, not just a mere Congress, but this was really going to be a kind of second constitutional convention for all of the reasons I have just laid out." So that brings me to the first debate I want to discuss, which was one of the very first debates to break out in the first Congress, the so-called removal debate. The first thing to know about the removal debate was that it was completely unexpected. It was not anything that people expected to be talking about. It grew out of the urgent work of facing Congress that I just mentioned. among the things Congress absolutely had to do right off the bat was create executive departments. At minimum, it seemed there needed to be departments of finance, war, and foreign affairs at bare minimum. So they got to work, ostensibly based on this broad agenda of setting up these executive departments. But things quickly narrowed onto one seemingly minute issue. And this arose when in the House of Representatives, James Madison introduced legislation to begin this process, to create a Department of Foreign Affairs, at the head of which would be a Secretary of Foreign Affairs, now what we call the Secretary of State. And it specified that this Secretary of Foreign Affairs would be appointed by the President with the advice and consent of the Senate, which is exactly what the Constitution required, but also included this clause at the end, and that the Secretary would be removable by the President. Now, to William Lawton Smith of South Carolina, it was this last clause that was objectionable and worth consideration. As he put it, the Constitution said absolutely nothing about the removal of executive officers other than impeachment. So Congress had no right to specify how these executive officers could be removed. All the Constitution said, according to Article 2, Section 4, was that executive officers, like the president, like the vice president, could be impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors. But other than that, it didn't say anything at all. So most people found William Lawton Smith's interjection here rather absurd. How could a government possibly function if its subordinate officers could not be removed? The idea that a Secretary of State would serve for life unless they committed a high crime or misdemeanor. But William Lawton Smith had seemingly hit upon something that really did demand a response. The Constitution was indeed silent on this question. It didn't say anything about the removal of executive officers. So what then were interpreters supposed to do in the face of constitutional silence? How were they supposed to proceed? So thus commenced what turned out to be a fairly sharp and searching debate that ended up consuming a great deal of Congress's time. When they had more to do than any Congress in the history of the country, they ended up spending 2 months on just this question, whether or not, or who, if anybody, could remove executive officers. And people at the time recognized the importance. It might seem to us somewhat small, but as Richard Bland Lee testified, the day on which this question shall be decided will be a memorable day, not only in the history of our times, but in the history of mankind, that on a proper or improper decision will be involved the future misery or happiness of the people of America. We might say this is a bit of hyperbole, but here is a congressman claiming what was in theory at stake. So there were 2 levels of debate here. There was a narrow one and a broader one. The narrow one was over this question of executive removal, but the broader one was really about how to interpret the Constitution. And the 2 levels sort of developed in tandem throughout the debate, reinforcing the importance of each. Debating executive removal was important on its own because it raised very important questions about the nature and scope of presidential authority. But debating removal was also important more generally because it forced congressmen to consider all of those open questions I began by specifying. It showed that a lot of the questions that had been considered and raised by the Constitutional Convention and ratification, that they had barely scratched the surface on a lot of these things. That to answer these questions about what to do in the face of constitutional silence required these kinds, it required answering some of these questions. Okay, so there are 2 levels of constitutional debate, and they were both considered as congressmen wrestled with 2 distinct, if intertwined, questions. The first question was, could anybody remove executive officers? Could they be removed at all? And if they could, the second question was, who had the authority to remove them? So to start with the first question, which was the first one that animated the debate, could anybody remove executive officers? Well, William Lawton Smith was adamant that nobody could remove executive officers. And at first, all the people who objected to him, who were clearly in the majority, made a series of practical arguments. How on earth could this make any sense? What if the executive officer was incompetent? What if they went senile? What if they neglected their duties? What if they did a bad job? We're just stuck with them forever? How does that make any sense? But William Lawton Smith kept saying over and over again that this was not a matter of expediency. This turned on constitutionality. It was not Congress's job to determine whether the Constitution made sense or not, or whether it was good or bad. It was simply Congress's job to follow the Constitution. As he and his small group of allies insisted, the Constitution, quote, must be the only rule to guide us. And in emphasizing this rule, William Lawton Smith kept pointing to the Constitution's literal words and demanding that proponents of removal show him exactly where the Constitution licensed the power in question. And he kept saying over and over again, they cannot show me in the Constitution where this power is. They instead show us what it ought to be rather than what it is. And to William Lawton Smith, he was making a bigger argument about constitutional silence. If the Constitution was silent, then Congress needed to respect that silence. They had no authority to fill the silence. If Congress assumed it could fill the silence, then, as Samuel Livermore said, one of William Lawton Smith's allies, if Congress could fill the silence, quote, we will make the whole Constitution nothing or anything, just as we please. This became a familiar theme. It was not just about removal. It was about whether Congress had the authority to flesh out, add to, or finish the Constitution. That is, to do more than simply follow it. The argument was being that to fill silences was not to follow it, but to transform it. As one senator put it, we're not here to make a constitution, we're merely here to execute one. And as another congressman put it, if we can do this, there is no end to our power. We may begin with the alpha and go to the omega, changing, reversing, and subverting every principle contained in it until there is no constitution left. Now, one naysayer in particular, Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, for whom we can thank for gerrymandering, now gerrymandering, felt more than a little vindicated by all of this, because he had been one of the 3 members at the Constitutional Convention who chose not to sign the final version of the document. And his major complaint when he chose not to sign it was how imprecise and ambiguously written the Constitution was, that this ambiguity would enable ambitious leaders to read meaning into what, in fact, wasn't there. This had been the source of his anti-federalism. And nearly 2 years later, as a member of the first federal Congress, his fears seemed to be unfolding before his eyes. As he said, if this is an omitted case, if there is silence here, an attempt by the legislature to supply the defect will be in effect an attempt to amend the Constitution. And eventually we may overturn the Constitution itself. This is what Gerry thought was at stake. So all of these arguments are made on the first question, why nobody could remove, which was really about if it's silent, period. Well, those on the opposite side of the question who thought that executive officers should be removed had to answer these arguments, these constitutional arguments. It was insufficient to merely appeal to policy or practicality. They had to explain why removal of executive officers was consistent with the Constitution. So what this meant is they had to turn this argument about constitutional silence on its head. What they argued was that opponents of removal simply misunderstood what constitutional silence amounted to. Of course, the Constitution was silent. Why wouldn't it be? It was foolish, after all, to think that any constitution could be born finished. As Egbert Benson said, it is simply not in the compass of human wisdom to frame a system of government so minutely. Abraham Baldwin echoed this. He said, if the convention had tried to account for everything that might emerge in the future, the Constitution would have swelled to the size of a folio volume. By its own silences, the Constitution was calling for the opposite of what opponents of removal had asked for. What it was calling for was for subsequent work on the part of Congress to fill these silences, to pick up where the convention had left off, and to see themselves as constitutional laborers who were constructing an edifice on a foundation that had been laid down. As Elias Boudinot put it, if we're not here to add to the Constitution, to fill in its silences, what are we even doing here? That is our main job. So the first question in the debate over whether executive officers could be removed threw a lot of fundamental issues into the air. And the significance of those issues, bigger questions about the Constitution, only deepened when congressmen considered the second question, not whether officers could be removed, but who in fact could remove them. And interestingly, this question, who should remove, divided proponents of removal and began pitting them against one another. So those who followed James Madison and what he had specified in the original bill claimed that the president alone should have the power to remove executive officers. But there were others who thought that this power should be lodged in the hands of the president and the Senate combined. So paralleling how the officer was appointed. An executive officer was appointed by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate. You wanted to remove him, you'd remove by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate. At first, this was less a constitutional struggle than one over political theory that very much revived debates that had been raging since the Revolution over the relationship between executive authority and Republican liberty. Was it better to have a strong president equipped with far-reaching discretionary authority? Or was it very dangerous to give a chief magistrate more power than was necessary? Those who supported presidential removal pointed to the experience of the Revolution, how it had been a want of executive energy at both the level of the state constitutions that had set up very weak executives, or in the Confederation government, which didn't have adequate executive authority. The experience of the Revolutionary War had shown how important it was to have energy in the executive branch. More than this, Locke, Montesquieu, and so many others had preached the importance of the separation of powers. So you should keep the executive and the legislative powers as separate as possible. So people like Madison said, you should only blend these at the bare minimum. And they also said, you needed to make sure that the executive was responsible for his own branch. Government worked much better when the executive was responsible, because if the executive misbehaved, everyone knew who to blame. The president couldn't blame it on the Senate. The president would have to take responsibility for himself. People on the other side who defended presidential senatorial removal drew very different lessons from the Revolution. They said the whole point of the Revolution had been to avoid monarchy. Executive power was inherently dangerous. And yet, here lay one of the key powers of the British royal prerogative, to give an extraordinary power of removal to a single executive. This seemed to lay the foundation for monarchy. Now, if the Constitution was indeed silent on removal, and if Congress had to fill the authority, then these arguments made a lot of sense, because presumably congressmen should vest the power of removal in whatever way they thought best promoted the principles of the Revolution. What was striking, though, is how proponents of removal began making a different set of arguments. Arguments that suggested that the Constitution was maybe not as silent as they had originally suggested to try to win debate one. The Constitution might have seemed silent on the question of removal, but if you dug beneath the surface a bit, you could actually find that it had some hidden meanings. So this began with people who were defending presidential senatorial removal. Not only was it bad to give the president such an important power, but they began saying it actually violated the Constitution. So the very same people who had just earlier said the Constitution was silent to rebut William Lawton Smith and his allies, were now suggesting that actually the Constitution spoke. And this was because, as they put it, it was in the, quote, nature of things that the power which appointed should remove. In other words, as they put it, according to the general principles of law and reason, Wherever the power of appointment was, removal had to follow in kind, that these two concepts, appointment and removal, were logically connected. Now, you could give one or the other to any number of combinations. So if the Constitution had given appointment strictly to the president, then removal should be with the president. But because the Constitution had given it to the president and the Senate, it was essential to the nature of law and reason that it should go, that removal should follow appointment, that the two were tightly connected. Some defenders of presidential removal followed in kind. So they too had earlier emphasized that the Constitution was silent, but now they began making a different argument as well. They began arguing that the power to remove was essentially executive in character. As one senator put it, removal was a right incidental to the executive, inseparably connected with it, that grows up naturally and unavoidably out of the thing itself. Some began pointing in particular to the vesting clause of Article 2, which came at the beginning of Article 2, which said that the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. Some, like James Madison, began saying that what this meant was that the president was invested with all of the executive power. And unless the Constitution specifically placed an executive power elsewhere, as it had done with appointment, by virtue of this clause, the power devolved on to the president. So because it was silent on removal, and because removal was an essentially executive power, it fell to the president by implication. Now, the fact that Madison was arguing this was especially striking, since at the beginning of the debate, he had been among the most outspoken that the Constitution was completely silent on the question. And he himself even acknowledged that his own views were changing. He came back to the debate in mid-June and says, "I have, since the subject was last before the House, examined the Constitution with attention. And I acknowledge that it does not perfectly correspond with the ideas I entertained of it from first glance." So in other words, the debate had really left a lot of participants feeling as though they were standing on a shaky foundation. So given how unsettled the debate had really left things, some congressmen offered yet another kind of argument. Perhaps the Constitution was silent, perhaps something about the nature of executive power or the relationship between appointment and removal encouraged one particular kind of reading, but some began asking, what had the framers of the Constitution actually intended? Now, as the convention's proceedings had been conducted in secret, and it'd be over half a century before Madison's famous notes were made available to the public, all they could rely on was the testimony of those who had been there, but many of whom were, of course, serving in the first Congress. So some of those congressmen began exploiting their insider knowledge, and people like Abraham Baldwin began saying, if there was one thing that was clear at the Constitutional Convention, it was that the delegates were eager to avoid too much of a mixture between the president's power and the Senate's power. So the original intent was to keep these separate as much as possible. James Madison echoed these remarks as well. So the removal debate set off a tentative search for a kind of inchoate original intent. And in some ways, this tentative search for a kind of original intent reflected the broader anxieties that I think the debate provoked. One, silence had revealed just how much there was to discuss and how many different arguments could be made. And in a sense, the whole debate could be captured by a single striking episode that turned on the so-called original intent. So at one point, because he loved tweaking his opposition, William Lawton Smith decided to be a bit clever. So he never relented on the idea that the Constitution was absolutely silent on removal. But nonetheless, he decided at one point that it was important to recognize that it had been the opinion of sensible men that removal was in fact vested in the president and Senate combined. And he said he had in mind here a publication of inconsiderable eminence in the class of political a publication of considerable eminence in the class of political writings on the Constitution. He was referring to the Federalist Papers. Now, the Federalist Papers were neither yet cloaked in national mystique, nor yet deemed the authoritative commentary on the Constitution that they were regarded as today, but they still commanded a significant interest. These 85 essays that had been written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay in defense of the Constitution during ratification were well known by the spring of 1789. And even though not everybody knew who the authors were, William Lawton Smith knew that Hamilton and Madison had written most of the essays. So here he decided that he would try to knock Madison down a peg by quoting Hamilton against him. So he quoted at length from Federalist 77, which said that because executive officers were to be appointed by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate, that in fact they should be removed by the president and Senate combined. So he was able to read Federalist 77 out loud, which really put Madison on his heels, which led to this remarkable episode, which William Lawton Smith recounted to a correspondent a few days later. In the course of my speech, I quoted the Federalist as an authority on my side. But then the next day, Egbert Benson sent me a note across the House to this effect, that Publius, or Hamilton, had informed him in the last 24 hours that upon more mature reflection, he had changed his opinion and was now convinced that the president alone should have the power of removal at pleasure. And he is a candidate for the office of Secretary of Finance. So Smith's confidence was shaken the next day when he received this note. But I think this anecdote reveals the extent to which this whole argument, this whole debate had really fueled quite a bit of chaos. Hamilton had claimed to change his mind completely. Madison was changing his mind across a different dimension. Some people were claiming that the Constitution was completely silent on executive removal and nothing could be done about it. Some people were claiming it was completely silent and lots could be done about it. Some people were claiming that it actually wasn't so silent, but then they were disagreeing about whether the president or the president and Senate combined should have this power. So there was a lot of internal contradiction and a lot of dust thrown up in the air, and nowhere did this become clearer than in the profoundly confusing and uncertain way in which the debate was ultimately resolved. So what would actually come of the clause that had set off this entire unexpected debate? This one here that said that the officer would be removable by the President of the United States. Once again, William Lawton Smith did a really good job of clarifying the stakes. He looked at defenders of presidential removal and he said, you need to be honest. You began by saying the Constitution was silent and Congress needed to vest this authority. Now you're claiming that the Constitution actually gives it to the president already. If the Constitution already gives it to the president, then we can get rid of this clause. It's completely redundant. If we're going to leave it in, then you should tell everybody right now that we're putting it in there because but for this clause, the president won't have this power. Now, this was a complicated question, remove the clause or not, because of course, proponents of presidential removal did not themselves agree. Some were absolutely convinced the Constitution was silent and they had to leave this clause in. Otherwise, the president wouldn't have this power. But others were convinced that by the nature of executive authority, the president already had the power. So in hopes of overcoming this issue, Egbert Benson proposed two clever amendments to the bill, which would each be voted on separately, which is the only way that this bill ever got passed. So what he said is, Amendment 1, I'm going to leave the controversial clause in, which you see in red here, but I'm going to add this other clause here in Part 2. Part 2 specified that there would be a clerk in the Department of Foreign Affairs. And what I'm going to do there is I'm going to say, whenever the principal officer has been removed by the president, the Department of Foreign Affairs papers shall fall into the custody of the clerk. So I'm going to add this amendment and we're going to vote on it. And then after we're done voting on that, my second amendment is going to be to get rid of the original clause. So what made this so clever was it completely muddied the waters. It implied that the president had the power, but without specifying why. And because it was two separate amendments, it was able to get the majorities necessary to pass it. But those majorities were completely different. The First Amendment, to just add this language to Part 2, was supported by everybody who defended presidential removal, whether they thought the Constitution was silent or not. But the Second Amendment was supported by a very weird group of people. It was supported by people like William Lawton Smith and Elbridge Gerry, who had been desperate to strike the clause from the very beginning because they didn't think Congress had any business specifying this. Apologies. They didn't think Congress had any power to specify this, but was also supported by people like James Madison, who had grown convinced that the president already had this power by his inherent executive authority. So people who had disagreed the whole time made up the majority on the second vote. So I think what we can see here is just how confusing this was, that ultimately the resolution was not much of a resolution at all, which ever since has led jurists and lawyers to fight endlessly over whether, in fact, members of the first Congress thought they had vested the removal power in the president by their own discretion or because the Constitution required it. In 1926, in the Supreme Court case Myers v. United States, which turned on Congress's authority to limit the removal power, Chief Justice William Howard Taft and Associate Justice Louis Brandeis divided over exactly this question. They wrote these extensive opinions that were all history papers from the first federal Congress, in which William Howard Taft argued Congress very much concluded that the president had the power based on the Constitution. And Brandeis said, that's not true at all. Congress didn't decide anything. They were in complete disagreement about whether or not the Constitution, independent of congressional discretion, vested this power. And that debate endures to this day. As recently as last summer, the Supreme Court heard a challenge to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which had been set up with a requirement that the head of the CFPB could only be removed for cause. So the president could not remove the head of the CFPB at pleasure, could only be removed for cause. And the Supreme Court struck this down as a violation of the president's authority, in part invoking the removal debate from 1789, that the president had this inherent executive authority. So the debates over the limits of presidential power and what was or was not intended in 1789 were of enormous importance and interest. But I think the 1789 removal debate also revealed something of profound historical importance. The resolution that was so uncertain very much confirmed what was otherwise uncertain at this time, the Constitution itself. The people who were involved in this debate had been forced to think seriously about the problem of constitutional silence, and they had been forced to consider a series of fundamental questions about the Constitution's essential nature. And what they had realized was there were not easy answers to these questions. Was the Constitution, in fact, unfinished and was it finished or incomplete? How much authority did subsequent users of the Constitution have to shape it? Was the Constitution brittle or malleable? The debate mattered so much, I think, because it confirmed that the struggle over the Constitution had really just begun. And I will stop there.
Well, let's, before we go to the document discussion piece, let's spend a minute or two, a couple minutes for preliminary questions. So if you have one, unmute and let us know what it is. Christine?
So during the removal debate, how much of this argument between the Congress members do you think was truly philosophical, and how much of it was political expediency?
Great, great classic question. Clearly, these being politicians in a partisan setting, the play of partisan interest is of essential importance. But in this case, it wasn't always obvious where one's partisan interest ought to lead them. So on the one hand, they knew George Washington was president. So some people, out of loyalty to him or a kind of sense that this was really a referendum on his administration to an extent, supported giving the president this power because they thought that was what it meant to be on his side. But it certainly was not that simple. Unlike other debates that broke out in the first Congress, like the one I'll talk about later today, that very clearly cut across regional and ideological lines. The removal debate in some ways was so interesting because, again, people didn't even anticipate that they were going to be having this debate. It didn't immediately pull on a partisan register. There were certainly longstanding disagreements going back to the Revolution about executive power generally, as I talked about. So people who had been on record for some time that they were anxious about executive power were usually eager to be consistent. But I think it was a sort of rare debate in which it was elevated to a pretty high principled level. I think that's one of the striking things about it.
Dan.
Quick question here on, it seems like the debate, as you were talking about, goes from a textualist interpretation of silence to original intent, but both rely on the tacit conclusion that the Constitution in some way is a fixed document, but yet they're also fleshing out the meat and from the bones at the same time. How did they square that circle, so to speak, with it being possibly a fixed document, but also then they're creating sort of the powers at the same time?
Yeah, well, I think this is precisely precisely what they can't square, or what they're struggling to square. Especially people like James Madison and others who are sort of talking out of both sides of their mouth. They begin by saying the Constitution is silent, it's supposed to be silent. So Madison repeated a lot of the arguments he had made in Federalist 37. Human language is not capable of creating a constitutional system that can anticipate all contingencies. We thus need to understand that we are here to fill in silences, to be creative. I mean, some of them even talk about they're adding to the Constitution. I mean, things that people wouldn't say today. A lot of them are perfectly content with that. But then they're sort of seduced by these other arguments, which kind of suggest in a very different way, you could argue a profoundly different way, just as you said, that the Constitution is actually requiring this based on a subtler interpretation of its text, or based on some insider knowledge about what was originally intended. Or maybe what the Federalist Papers said, although in this case they were profoundly unhelpful because they said the exact opposite of what most people in the debate would have preferred them to have said, which is why Hamilton had to change his mind. So I think the key point is they didn't come to an easy resolution of this. Instead, what the removal debate produced was not an answer, which is what most jurists are after. What I think it did was it showed how many profound questions had not been answered, including especially the one you laid out so well. These things are in tension. They conjured up different ways of thinking about the Constitution. And if you couldn't really hold both in your mind clearly at the same time, or if so, you had to explain why.
Jonathan, there's the founders always looked at two things: reflection and history, when they're considering different issues. And so the Federalist Papers and the comment that Hamilton made is obviously on that side of reflection. What about experience? They had 13 stages that they could look at the state level. Did anyone in Congress refer to what state governors did as far as removal?
Yes. had I had more time, this was yet another thing that William Lawton Smith emphasized. He says, I've looked back through all the state constitutions and I cannot find one that vests this kind of removal power in a state executive. It was open to interpretation in a few instances, but he was certainly right that the vast majority of the state constitutions, especially those that had been written in 1776, in sort of the throes of anti-royalist enthusiasm and created very weak executives, had deliberately stripped this power of the executive and given it to the legislature. So William Lawton Smith made a lot of this. And the fact that others wouldn't engage him on it was very revealing that they thought he was probably right, and they didn't want to argue on those terms. To the extent they did, they said, oh, remember when the state constitutions were horrible at prosecuting the war for independence, in part because vigorous executives are actually quite essential to Republican liberty, not the great threat we've always assumed. Legislatures can be just as tyrannical. I mean, the war effort was a disaster in part because the governors didn't have the power to act independent of legislatures and executive councils.
Chris, you had a question?
Yeah, I was just curious. Do you know what caused Madison to change his mind?
Yeah, great question. I mean, he certainly portrayed it as he was one to, as merely based on reflection. Others have speculated that because he was so close to George Washington and was a de facto advisor from his role in the House, that they clearly had conversations about it. What was said, we don't know. That he might have been convinced that Washington needed this power, but it was consistent with things Madison had earlier said about the separation of powers. One of the things he had been willing to acknowledge. So anti-federalists had leveled all these criticisms, and many of them he dismissed as completely wrong-headed. Some of which, though, he claimed made a really good point. One of them was this concern that the Constitution blended the executive and legislative power too much, because there were all these things the president did with the Senate. As we know, treaties, appointment of Supreme Court justices, so on and so forth. That it was meaningful to restrict that to just what the Constitution required and not to extend it any further. But this argument about the vesting clause, unclear where exactly it came from, because it hadn't really been made. It really hadn't been made at all prior to this debate. This idea that the executive power was vested in the president, and that meant all the executive power minus whatever had been removed. So the basic argument here was the enumeration of executive power was merely illustrative. President had a partial veto. The president could appoint all these things. That wasn't a list of what the president could do. Those were just illustrations of executive power. This argument has lived on in a big way. I mean, this was the argument that the George W. Bush administration used to defend the legality of the war on terror, the enhanced interrogation techniques. They drew heavily on these arguments from 1789 and the 1790s on this idea of executive power being vested in the president completely, and only those things that had been expressly deleted out of executive power were not automatically given to the president. So if anything was executive in nature, the president has that power. Nobody before June of 1789 that I'm aware of had made this argument. Nobody made it during ratification. Nobody made it at the Constitutional Convention. I could be wrong about that. I haven't been able to find an example of this argument prior to this. So I don't know where Madison got it.
So is this like an early form of the unitary executive then?
There's no group of people in the world who is more obsessed with the decision of 1789 and William Howard Taft's interpretation of it than unitary executive theorists in law schools and elsewhere.
Anything else before we head to our first discussion? Yeah, Joseph.
Yeah, I wonder if there's when under Johnson's administration, when the Tenure of Office Act, if there was any discussion of the debate of 1789, or did that come up during Reconstruction when they were debating this?
It absolutely did in a big way. I wish I had the details more at my fingertips, but it was certainly a big part of the congressional debate, because this was understood to be the precedent. But of course, what made it so great was it was entirely unclear what they had actually decided. So it was really in the eye of the beholder. But yeah, I wish I knew the details better, but this was absolutely a big part of Andrew Johnson's defense.
Christine again.
So from other seminars with this organization, professors have said that delegates to the Constitutional Convention sometimes had their concerns waylaid about executive power because people were rather clear that Washington would be the first president. Does that same principle follow through with the first term in Congress?
It certainly does to an extent, although I think it gives them too little credit to think, given that they were thinking more broadly and spoke openly about creating a constitutional order that would endure for the ages, that they were thinking just on that narrow horizon. Because almost everything that was written in defense of the presidency was about why the mechanisms that had been set up would prevent effectively, kind of lawless populist demagogues from coming to power. This was what Hamilton argued in Federalist 68 and elsewhere, that it was a mortal certainty that only men of eminence and high character and great talent would rise to the presidency, because the small arts of popularity and the rest that would exist at the state level, you couldn't do that at sort of a continental level. So they were openly talking about life after Washington. They certainly assumed that Washington would be the first one. And it would have been very hard to sell Article 2 without that, just like it would have been very hard to sell the Constitution without Washington's imprimatur. But I think it's most of them were thinking beyond that, and they couldn't. But you can't discount the extent to which Washington's there shaping the conversation.
Well, with that in mind,
Tim, Pat Coffee had a question.
Pat Coffee. I'm sorry, Pat.
Thanks. No, that's all right. I couldn't help thinking with your talk, Jonathan. I just covered the Supreme Court in AP Government, and I'm regretting my students' answers, and they're not doing a very good job of understanding judicial activism and judicial restraint. And as you were going through the debate, it just kept on coming at me, and I'm just wondering if there is any link between the debates that are going on right here about executive powers and the whole idea of the judicial branch and judicial activism and judicial restraint. So I was wondering if you could speak on that.
Sure. So do you mean the debate we're having today, or what they all?
The one today, I guess the connection between anything today and just the general argument of activism and restraint, and if there's any connection between your debate.
I think so. I mean, I think in many ways that language, which is not unique to American constitutionalism, but has a distinct flavor that has informed so much of our constitutionalism. You could certainly see it prior to 1789, because anti-federalists already had said so much about the Constitution is ambiguously written. It's going to allow those under power, and especially federal judges, to make of it what they please. It's going to be clay in their hands. But what William Lawton Smith argued in this debate, it was really establishing the script of, I think, what you were describing, not just that the Constitution should be read very strictly and almost literally, but setting up this dichotomy between passively receiving the Constitution and actively turning it into something it's not. That what the removal debate did, among other things, I think, is it really sharpened the language of that kind of painting that kind of constitutional interpretive creativity as not in any way a virtue, but fundamentally subversive to the Constitution itself. So in the modern era, defenders of textualism and originalism and their varieties traffic in a very similar language. It was born of a similar moment, a similar sort of frustration that the Warren and Burger courts were allegedly legislating from the bench, that this was judicial activism run amok. We, the people, had been replaced by we, the judges. And it revived a similar kind of language that William Lawton Smith was offering. And I think in many ways you can see the responses to Smith as being responses that people also generate now, which is if we're to do with the Constitution as you say, the government can't work. You're just fundamentally misunderstanding the project of constitutionalism. But it did, it draws, when you draw bright lines, they have a real rhetorical effect. And so I think that's a clear connection.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I'm glancing around. I want to make sure that everybody has a chance, but if there are no questions at this point, Lily, if you could move us into the document sessions.